And hello again to another spontaneous chat thought from myself in this perspective series. And the thoughts that are in my head um, result from a conversation I had yesterday with a friend and colleague. We had a recorded conversation between Arthur Vess Lewis, who's in the head of the Department of Religious Studies in Michigan State University, and also a well-published author on esoteric and Western Hermetic traditions. And we was having a conversation. In fact, it may come out very soon, this podcast, perhaps even before this video comes out. We were talking about a range of things, and we got to the subject of where we might be going to in the future, and how we could seed future communities. And one thing I said, well, this is a kind of tongue-in-cheek answer, but I said we could be seeing a kind of splitting of humanity, similar to H.G. Wells in The Time Machine. That storyline, when the character goes to the future, they see that humanity has in fact devolved rather than evolved. And there were two groups, one the Eloi, who live above ground, are very childlike and innocent, and the Morlocks, who are the deformed creatures living underground. Well, in a kind of similar way, not the same, but a similar way, I said we could see that in the future there will be those people who have decided to gather themselves into smaller communities, perhaps living more rural-like, more sustainable. They're living with people who share like-minded thoughts. They could be intentional communities, and they're more interested in local concerns rather than the globalization. And the other group would be stuck inside the metaverse, living this kind of digital age, a bit similar to how it's portrayed in the book and film Ready Player One, which for me is quite dystopian. But what we're pointing out is that rather than specifying what the two groups will be doing, i.e. metaverse and community living, which is, just a kind of rough, broad framing, the definitive kind of way to see these two groups is that one grouping is aligned with what we may call the natural order, and the other one would be an artificial order. Now, again, that's kind of black and white, but again, this is just a broad framing. What I mean by that is that a natural order understands that the human being is not alone in the cosmos. It's not an isolated species. We are not just a result of an accident of evolution, which has been a dominant narrative for so long, but it's obviously, you can pick holes in that all the way through it. And that, so in the future, this natural order will understand that humanity also has a sacredness, is connected to the sacred source, the impulse that seeds into materiality, i.e. we know that the material expression is a manifestation from non-materiality, and that everything is conscious. The universe, the cosmos, all life comes from the field of conscious intelligence. And materiality is one aspect of, or one particular state of that consciousness. And so the natural order is to recognize, remember that humanity is a part of that sacred order. So when we are living in the world and developing, we're also developing and reconnecting to that sacred understanding, our lineage, our heritage. And so we need to revitalize that sacred connection in order to evolve further and not stagnate as a species. And the other side is artificial, because it's severing that connection. And I mentioned that Rudolf Steiner, the Austrian mystic and philosopher had stated over 100 years ago, in the beginning of the 1900s, that deep materialism of the future would sever humankind from the spiritual impulse. And that would be the intention, the, let's say, deliberate design behind those that are furthering materialism, is to try to isolate humanity and focus purely on the external material world, and to therefore to cut off humanity's conscious connection to the metaphysical reality. And by severing that connection, the human being then will be even further embedded into the materiality. And that for me is artificialness, because it's denying the heritage and the sacred connection of the human being. I don't mean it's artificial because it's digital. That's just a kind of, Luddite kind of trope. I'm not being a Luddite because I favor the correct use of technology, such as I'm using now. And technology is really the processes of how human beings utilize and interact with the material world around them. Our early ancestors who discovered fire was an early form of technology, and sustaining the fire. And so our instruments, the first instruments that they used to hunt or for agriculture were technologies. So there's a correct use of technology, which I've talked about before in other talks. But the artificialness refers to cutting off the human being from the metaphysical reality, or from source, or the larger cosmic natural order. And that, I think, is the framing of this division. How in the future those people will seek to nurture and revitalize the sacred impulse, or the transcendental impulse that runs through all materiality and runs into this world, or those individuals or segments of humanity who will forget or even denounce or deny the transcendental sacred impulse, and will be pulled into the purely artificial realms which deny the metaphysical reality. And that, we discussed that, and we discussed what are the future potentials of that. And our conclusion in the talk between me and Arthur Vess Lewis was that in the end the natural order will always win out, because an artificial order doesn't have sustainable vital energies backing it up. When something is artificial, you have to throw more energy at it to sustain it. If a boulder or a stone is rolling down a hill, that's the natural order. And if you try to stop that, you need a great amount of energy to resist it. The same with a stream. The natural flow of a stream takes much more energy to try to block it, to dam it up, because that's an artificial intervention into the natural flow. So if you create a dam, you need much more energy to sustain that position than the energy that's in the natural flow. So what's happening now is that those groups or people invested into developing the artificial construct have to put much more energy into sustaining that, whereas the natural order has its own vital flow. And so it's like trying to hold back the tide. Inevitably the tide will come through. And that's why we concluded in our talk, and I hope that I will put out the talk on social media and in my newsletter, and I do hope that people will view that. It's a video podcast, that talk, because we concluded that ultimately we are positive about the human future, because although you can hold back natural development for a while, you can hold back the tide for a while, not forever, it will come through. And so there will be this vitalism that's going to come in to the earth and through humanity. And although there may be some disruptions and dissonance as we're seeing right now, at some point that resistance will be broken down, because just by natural order, the, 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 the correct flow of life will find itself. So I think that's a positive thought to keep in mind. And just as a side note, which was not part of our talk yesterday, several days ago, on the 19th of July, I released a video about the ABE updates. And some of you may be familiar with my ABE updates, the other series of videos where we get messages from the consciousness field. And in this particular episode, refers to a question that I asked Abe. And I asked Abe a few months ago on the 27th of March of this year, 2022, what is the nature of evil as we understand it? Or how would Abe consider the nature of evil in this realm? And Abe replied very specifically with just one phrase, evil is psychic manipulation in action. Psychic manipulation in action. And if you think about it, what's happening now, especially with the advancement of the world, the rise in technologies, the push into this artificial construct, is that it's becoming a consensus narrative. The organizations, the driving players of the world are trying to persuade everybody, or trying to sell humanity on this tech-driven future, on the metaverse. They're saying that the economy of the metaverse will soon outgrow the physical economy. The future's a metaverse, blah, blah, blah. Everything is going towards transhumanism. They're trying to make that, and they're trying to construct that into the consensus narrative. So everybody goes along with it willingly by adapting that consensus narrative as their own thinking, their own belief, their own opinions. And that manipulation of the consensus narrative is psychic manipulation in action. That is what we can see as being evil, how we are being psychically manipulated to believe in a certain narrative, and therefore a certain worldview and a certain vision of the future. And that is also a definition of tyranny. Tyranny is when we are forced, either overtly or covertly, to think and therefore to act in a certain way that is controlled and benefiting the small minority. So we should be aware of the consensus narrative. But as I said, ultimately the positive human future will follow, in my understanding and my trust, will follow the natural order of a vital human being that remembers our legacy and our heritage and our sacred connection to a living, intelligent cosmos. Thank you.